The pictures were painted directly through me, without any preliminary drawings, and with great force. I had no idea what the paintings were supposed to depict. Nevertheless, I worked swiftly and surely without changing a single brushstroke. What a Human Being Is, Hilma af Klint, and the Frontier of Abstract Art. Using her spiritual life as inspiration for her art, Hilma af Klint sparked what we now know as the abstract art movement and introduced a new artistic frontier. Hilma af Klint was born in 1862 in Solna, Sweden, as the fourth child of Matilda and Victor af Klint. The Protestant couple and their 4 children lived together in Karlberg Castle, the naval academy in which Victor was based. Af Klint was very close with her mother. She lived with Hilma well into adulthood and later became an inspiration for her art. At the age of 18, Af Klint began attending the technical school, where she became a talented portrait painter. Af Klint was interested in math, science, nature, and like many other artists of her time, the spiritual world. This year, however, held much more change for Af Klint than she initially expected. Af Klint's sister, Hermina, passed away. The death of her dear sister compelled her to more seriously explore the intangible world, in hopes of connecting with her sister once again. Af Klint's art was a reaction of her spiritual life and connections. In 1896, Af Klint and a group of women began calling themselves Des Femmes, or the Five. These women used a device called a psychograph to enter a trance. This device supposedly recorded psychic transmissions and allowed them to communicate with the spiritual world. The women expressed these messages through freehand movements. They claimed to have repeatedly made contact with spirits who they knew as High Masters, and documented their experiences using automatic drawing and writing practices. This method of recording their connections required the women to express unconscious parts of their creativity in drawing and writing, becoming the first opening for abstraction in art. The practice of creating automatic drawings is one that forces the artist to free themselves up, and to allow their hand to be guided, or to really free associate, and to move without much forethought. It was 1904 that Af Klint said she was contacted by a spirit named Amelil. During this particular seance, Af Klint said she was commissioned by the spirit to create a series of paintings on the astral plane, once again using the psychograph to enter this process. Af Klint said that the spirit told her to paint the immortal aspects of man. Her paintings to any other person seemed incoherent. Her personal life connections to deeper ideas made the paintings what they were. Rather than fame or influence, these connections were what drove Af Klint's artistic inspiration. She began work in 1904 and spent a productive 4 years working on this cycle, called Paintings for the Temple. This period of creativity was broken in 1908 when Af Klint presented her work to Rudolf Steiner, an Austrian architect, spiritualist, social reformer, and pioneer of the anthroposophy movement, in hopes of a good reaction. Af Klint met Rudolf Steiner at one of his lectures about his Rosicrucian teachings. She looked up to and admired Steiner's ideas. However, Steiner disapproved of Af Klint's new artistic breakthroughs and made his disapproval evident to her. He told Af Klint that no one should see her work for the next 50 years. This statement stayed with Af Klint for the rest of her life, and caused her to pause her work until 1912. She resumed and completed the paintings for the temple between 1912 and 1915. During this first creative period of her life, Af Klint described her inspiration as driven by a divine force. The way the story is unusually told is that she worked on these pieces transcribing messages, which involved imagery but also dictums about process. So for instance, that she should work for 4 days and then rest for 4 days. It's really led by the guides that she's communicating with. This series of 193 inspired paintings were just the beginning of Hilma af Klint's life at the frontier of a new artistic world. The death of Af Klint's mother in 1920 triggered a second creative period. A pattern became evident in Af Klint's life, and awakenings resulting from the death of a loved one. This second creative period was marked by the exploration of the intricacies of flowers and trees. Af Klint moved to Helsingborg in southern Sweden and joined the Anthroposophic Society, where she once again worked with Rudolf Steiner. At long last, Steiner began to appreciate Af Klint's work, and they became immersed in each other's ideas. Despite eventually establishing a good relationship with Steiner, his original disapproval of her work left a lasting impression on Klint. Klint's works were expressions of her spiritual life. Every time I succeed in finishing one of my sketches, my understanding of humanity, animals, plants, minerals, or the entire creation becomes clearer. I feel freed and raised up above my limited consciousness.
The way she's trying to think about her work and how it's used, I do think that enables her to kind of step out a little bit from, she's not painting for the critics. She's not painting for a gallerist. She's doing so from a different impulse, which I think helps her on that level.
Klint knew her work was powerful and important. However, she understood that, just like Steiner, the rest of the world wouldn't be able to understand and appreciate them for what they were. She believed her art held messages for all humanity, but that only the future audiences would properly understand them. This influenced Klint's decision to keep her art hidden until 20 years after her death. Klint died in a trolley accident in 1944. The delayed appreciation of Klint's work was therefore partially a result of her own wishes. Her collection, comprising of over 1,200 paintings, 100 texts, and 26,000 pages of notes and sketches, was hidden from the public until 1986, when her work was exhibited for the first time, 20 years beyond when her self-imposed restraint on exhibiting her work expired. Even though Klint's art is now regarded as the first abstract art ever created, it was not always credited as such. Vasily Kandinsky, an abstract painter of the time, was miscredited with pioneering the abstract art movement for decades. Klint created her first abstract piece in 1906, followed by Kandinsky's first abstract piece in 1911. Klint evidently predated Kandinsky by 5 years with her first painting for the temple. The 20 years after her death, in which Klint intended her work to be kept secret, was unintentionally extended by an additional 22 years, with her first exhibition in 1986. Though the two artists never met, Klint's art remained in the shadows of Kandinsky's work. Klint was the first to use her spirituality as inspiration for abstract art, a practice later used by Kandinsky and other abstract artists. More recent scholarship has acknowledged Klint's rightful place at the head of the abstract art movement, with her works becoming more widely known. Since being discovered in 1986 by the public, Klint's art has gained great popularity. Currently, her works are being exhibited in museums in Stockholm, New York, Berlin, and London, showing that her work is still relevant more than 100 years after its creation and almost 50 years after it was revealed to the public. Klint's art allows viewers to explore her works in many different ways with numerous possible interpretations.
Overall, she's a pioneer and charting new frontiers in abstraction. I also think these frontiers of spirituality and art, they're embedded in each other for centuries, but at the same time, there is this tendency in the 20th century to think about art in very secular terms. So I think, we might think about some frontiers that became split. For so long, art was a religious practice, and then it became very social and political, and the religious side drops out, at least in terms of how people think about art. So I think it's really interesting to think about that frontier of spirituality to be so much a part of what she's doing, because we often, I think, became disconnected from art having that relationship.
Klint braved new frontiers in the art world in multiple ways. Her work as the first abstract artist was certainly monumental and held a great deal of new promise for the artists up until today. But she also did her work in a time when women in the art world were only just becoming truly accepted. Thus, her second frontier, which she unintentionally explored after death, was that of gaining acknowledgement, acceptance, and eventually respect from her male counterparts. She explored a remarkable frontier in her ability to do this, since she was secure with the knowledge that her art was not for the world, but for herself. Hilma Klint didn't intend on having fame or influence at all, yet remarkably created a frontier nonetheless.